Okay, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. In this recording, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 26, verses 31 through 56. And keep in mind where we're at in the story of Jesus. They have just completed the Passover meal, what we often call the Last Supper, where Jesus has warned them of a betrayer among them, that one of his closest disciples is going to betray him and hand him over to the authorities. In that same episode, that same context, Jesus also instituted what we call communion, or the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist, this memorial meal with bread and wine where we remember Jesus' body and blood. Then they have sung a hymn, and now they're on their way out towards the Mount of Olives, outside the city of Jerusalem, across the Kidron Valley, up the slopes out of the city, and towards the Mount of Olives. And that's where we pick up here in Matthew chapter 26, verse 31. It reads like this. Then Jesus said to them, to his disciples, "You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." And notice he's quoting from the Old Testament, for it is written, and he quotes this passage, and the passage is found in Zechariah 13, verse 7. And in its original context, it referred to God striking down his appointed leader and the people of Israel being scattered as a result. Jesus, however, applies this to himself, says that's the same thing that's going to happen to him and to his disciples. And he's been preparing them for this moment, telling them that it was coming, and now it's here. But, and this is important, scattering is not the final word. So look at verse 32. But after I have been raised, Jesus says, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. And so he is going to be struck down. The disciples are going to be scattered, but then he's going to be resurrected, raised. And he says, I will lead you into Galilee again. And so scattering and striking down is not the final word. Now, in this context where he's warned them that they're all going to fall away because of him on this particular night, Peter, full of bravado, insists he will never do that. He is too loyal and too strong for such a thing as that. And so look at verse 33. Peter says, even if they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. He believes that he is beyond that. He's too loyal, too faithful, too strong, too courageous to fall away. So even if all the others do, not him. And Jesus, in verse 34, said to him, truly I say to you that this very night, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter, you're going to fall away. In fact, this very night, you're going to deny me 3 times. So don't think that you're so strong and so courageous and so awesome. But Peter said, in verse 35, Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And then all the other disciples joined in and said the same thing as well. And so Jesus warned them what's coming. He's warned them of how they're going to respond. They insist they're better than that. They're stronger than that. And then finally they arrive where they're heading on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. And this is how the story unfolds. Verse 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and told his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. Gethsemane was a garden spot on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. It actually comes from a word meaning olive or oil press, like an olive oil press was there. So it's a olive grove where olive oil would be pressed from the olives. And we don't know the exact location of this garden in the first century. There are several options that have been suggested. Obviously, if you go to Jerusalem today, there's a traditional location that does have some ancient olive trees within it and is probably at least in the approximate spot. And Jesus had gathered in this place often. And so John notes in his recounting of this that Judas knew the spot. He knew where to find Jesus on this particular occasion. Jesus could have gone somewhere else and hidden from Judas, but he doesn't. He goes to his well-known place and he tells his disciples, you sit here, I'm going to go over there and pray. And he took 3 of his closest disciples with him, while he moves away from the group to pray for a bit. So, verse 37, he took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, James and John, with him, and began to be grieved and distressed. And then he said to them, notice, he's communicating this to his 3 closest friends and disciples, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." First thing to notice there is the emphasis on Jesus' emotional state. It's important not to overlook this. He's distressed and troubled. He says that my soul is deeply grieved, even to the point of death. Like Jesus, we have to remember this, even though he is fully God, he's also fully human, and he experiences the full range of human emotions. And here, the weight of what lies ahead is just crushing down upon him. And he shares these feelings with his 3 closest friends. And he asks them to keep watch, which we learn from the following context includes praying. He wants them to keep watch and pray while he goes a little further away from them and prays by himself. Well, here's what happens. Verse 39, he went a little bit beyond them, fell on his face in this turmoil, in this stress, in this emotional agony. Jesus gets away just by himself, a little bit from his friends, lays out prostrate before the Lord on his face, and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." When he says, "Remove this cup, let this cup pass from me," he's referring to the cup of suffering. The cup of the suffering of crucifixion, the suffering of this experience of being forsaken by the Father, this suffering that is about to come his way. He's asking for that to be removed from him. And this reminds us that at one level, Jesus really doesn't want to undergo what he's about to endure. And he, as a human being, would prefer not to do this. And so he's asking, could you remove this? And then he says, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." That "yet not" really means like nevertheless or however. So whatever Jesus' preference is, God's will is the only will that really matters to him. And so even though I would prefer to not go through this, God, your will be done. He gets up from his praying. He comes back to his 3 closest friends, Peter, James, and John, and this is how he finds them. Verse 40, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And so they're so tired, it's late at night. Jesus told them to keep watch and pray, and instead they're sleeping. And he focuses attention on Peter because Peter is so vocal and was so full of bravado just half an hour ago. And he said to Peter, "So you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" Instead of keeping watch and praying, they're sleeping. And Peter, who was full of bravado, is sleeping. He said he would never fall away. He's too loyal, but now he can't even keep watch for an hour and pray. Instead, he falls asleep with the other 2. So Jesus restates the need to them to watch and pray, to all 3. It's addressed to all of them, and he gives them a reason for it. Look at verse 41. Keep watching, like don't sleep. Keep watching and praying so that you do not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so we need to remember that this in Greek is plural. It's addressed not just to Peter, but to all 3. And what Jesus says is the hour of testing is just about upon them. When he says, so that you do not come into temptation, that word temptation is just the word that basically means testing. And it could be a temptation test or a trial test, depending on the context in the New Testament. So it's the hour of testing. They're about to be tested to see what's really within them and how loyal they really are and how faithful their heart really is. The hour of testing is upon them. And then Jesus reminds them, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. It doesn't matter how much they want to be loyal, how much they don't want to be scattered like sheep. It doesn't matter how tough Peter thinks he is. The spirit may be willing, but the flesh is weak. So they better watch and pray to be strong enough to endure this hour of testing that's upon them. So with that charge, he expects them to watch and pray. He goes away again to pray some more himself, verse 42. And he went away again a second time and prayed, saying, "My Father, if this cup cannot pass away unless I drink from it, your will be done." And he's aligning his resolve and his will with the Father's will, and he's receiving strength for what lies ahead. He gets up again after his praying for a while along these lines, and verse 33, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So he's encouraged them and challenged them to watch and pray. You're going to need extra strength to endure what's coming this night. And yet, once again, they're sleeping because their eyes are heavy. So he himself leaves them again and prays some more. Verse 44, and he left them again. He went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. And I think it's important to note how Matthew has structured this particular story with the contrast between Jesus and these three. They're his closest. Peter thinks he's so strong. He's been very courageous throughout his ministry. He's grown immensely. And yet in this moment, they're sleeping and Jesus is praying. And Jesus is faithful in the hour of testing, and Peter denies Jesus in the story that lies ahead. And that contrast here seems to be very intentional by how Matthew has structured this to help us see, how did Jesus prepare and how did they fail to prepare? Well, after praying a third time, Jesus once again comes back to Peter, James, and John, and then the whole group of disciples in verse 45. It says, "Then he came to the disciples and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's go. Behold, the one who is betraying me is near.'" The fact is, Jesus could actually see them coming. They're coming with torches. It's night. He's up on a hillside. They have to go out of the city and down across the valley and back up the hillside. He can see them coming, and he could have fled up into the Judean wilderness where David had fled from Saul centuries before, and he could have been hidden from them, gone. They would have never found him. He could have fled, but he doesn't. He's prepared for this. He's prayed. He's ready. He knows this is the mission that the Father's given. So he says, "No, let's go meet them." And so his human weakness is real. He didn't really want to go through this, but his means of strength is praying, and that's the model for all disciples. Though his body and humanity was weak, he was made strong through prayer. They, on the other hand, have been sleeping. They're not really ready for this moment, but he is, and he's ready to face what lies ahead. And so he says, let's go meet them. And so as this episode unfolds and the episodes ahead unfold, pay attention to what happens to the disciples and how they respond in contrast to how Jesus handles the situation. And so, verse 47, while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs, who came from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Notice it's from the chief priests and the elders. That is, this is a Jewish contingent. These aren't Roman soldiers who have come to arrest him. It's a collection of Jews from the chief priest and the elders there in Jerusalem, some of whom are probably likely part of the temple security force. And they've come to Jesus to arrest him, and Judas, one of the 12, is leading them. Verse 48, now he, that is Judas, who was betraying him, gave them a sign previously saying, whomever I kiss, he's the one, arrest him. It's late, it's dark, right? They want to make sure they get the right guy. So Judas has arranged this sign. He'll go up to Jesus. He'll give him a kiss of greeting. And that's the signal. He's the one to arrest. And so immediately, verse 49, Judas went up to Jesus and said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Think of that. This is supposed to be a greeting of respect, a greeting of honor, calling him by this title of rabbi, giving him a kiss of greeting. And now it's the sign of betrayal. But Jesus said to him in verse 50, "Friend, do what you've come for." Notice that. Jesus doesn't dishonor him, doesn't get angry, calm resolve, no calm to arms. Friend, do what you've come for. Jesus knows the Father's will, and he's prepared because he's been praying for the last few hours. And then they came and laid their hands on Jesus and arrested him. And verse 51 says, "Behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Without waiting, one of the disciples grabs his sword, swings it. The result is he cuts off a man's ear, not just any man, the servant of the high priest." This little passing part of the episode is mentioned in all four Gospels, and so in some sense it stood out to the Gospel writers. And John, in his account, actually identifies who this person is who did this, and that person is Peter. It's Peter who grabs the sword. Peter is the one who cuts off the servant of the high priest's ear, and we actually learn that servant's name, his name is Malchus, from the Gospel of John, John 18:10. Listen to how Jesus replies to his disciples, verse 52. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place. For all those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Violence begets violence. The sword is not Jesus' way. So put the sword away. That's not how we're doing this." And then he says, "Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" Like if I wasn't supposed to walk this path, if we were supposed to fight our way out of this, I don't need swords. Like the Father has the whole armies of heaven at his disposal, and he could send them and rescue me if that's what was supposed to happen. But that's not the Father's will, and Jesus isn't asking for that. And so he says in verse 54, "How then would the scriptures be fulfilled which say it must happen this way?" This is the way it has to go. This is what the scriptures have been pointing toward. The story of Israel has been leading up to this moment. And then after saying that to his disciples and to Peter, now Jesus turns to the crowd who's come to arrest him, and here's what it says, verse 55. "At that time Jesus said to the crowds, 'Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a man inciting a revolt? Every day I used to sit with you in the temple grounds teaching, and you didn't arrest me. But all this has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets will be fulfilled.'" Jesus is not someone intending to lead a revolt. That's not how he sees this going down. That's not what his mission is. That's not how he's going to deliver and rescue the world. Jesus isn't calling his followers to fight with swords. He's not going to go out in a blaze of glory. No, that's not the way the scriptures, he says, are to be fulfilled. And what he seems to mean by that is the passages such as the suffering servant passages found in Isaiah, like Isaiah 53, and really the whole tenor of the Hebrew scriptures with all the themes and all its aims with sacrifice and lambs and all of that. Think back to where Matthew has already told us how Jesus has emphasized this. He said, "I didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill it, to bring it to its intended culmination point." And so here in verse 54, as well as in verse 56, Matthew quotes Jesus in this moment, making sure we don't miss that this is actually the way the scriptures will be fulfilled. This is the culmination, if you will, of the story of the Hebrew scriptures. And so he's not coming out to lead a revolt. He's going to lay down his life. That's the way that the scriptures of the prophets will be fulfilled. And then in that moment, as they arrest him and they begin to seize him and drag him away, all the disciples, it says, left him and fled. Remember, this episode started with Jesus quoting from Zechariah saying, "I will strike down the shepherd and all the sheep will be scattered." And we end this episode with that very thing happening. They're all being scattered. They're all fleeing out of the garden and saving their own skin. But Jesus, full of courage and calm resolve, after praying this through, he meets his accusers, meets his betrayer, meets those who have come to arrest him, and essentially voluntarily gives himself up to them. And so let me just end this little session with this reflection. What stands out to me here is Jesus' resolve, his courage. He's the one that really has calm control of the situation. They've come out to arrest him. They've got swords. They've got clubs. Peter is thinking he's going to fight and go out in a blaze of glory, but not Jesus. He puts Peter and his disciples in his place. He challenges this crowd saying, you could have arrested me any day in the temple. He knows why they didn't. He knows they were trying to avoid a riot, but he's trying to warn them, like, we didn't need all this subversion. And all of this stands in stark contrast to the disciples who are sleeping, who are swinging swords, and then who are running off and hiding. And what we see in this contrast is this simple little lesson that I think Matthew has recorded in the way he's told this story. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And because you deep down want to be loyal, you actually need to prepare for the hour of testing by praying faithfully and earnestly and devotedly like Jesus did. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generosity of people just like you. So thanks a ton to each and every one of you who faithfully support this ministry. May God lead you and bless you for your generosity, and may you be encouraged to know that God is using your resources for His name's sake all around the world. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you've been blessed or impacted in some way by the Listener's Commentary, could I invite you to prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters? You can do that by swinging over to listenerscommentary.com, clicking the Give button, and setting up a one-time or recurring donation right there. Thanks a ton for your support.